You often hear that what Israel is doing in Gaza is a genocide.
Yeah, you hear that, and you hear a lot of other lies about Israel as well. You hear about illegal occupations, illegal settlements, theft of land, and all of these things. And just taking one of those examples, you'll hear many people saying that Israel has been illegally occupying Gaza, which is why Hamas have tried to resist Israel's illegal occupation. It's nothing like the truth. In 2005, Israel completely withdrew from Gaza. They took all the civilians out of Gaza and they took all the military out of Gaza and they left Gaza to the Palestinians to run it. Instead of running it, instead of trying to run it as a viable entity, Hamas built it as a military base to attack Israel from and have been doing so ever since. And Israel, quite rightly, therefore, has blockaded Gaza, has prevented people from leaving except under strict controls in order to defend its own people. And Egypt has done the same thing. You don't very often hear about Egypt. Egypt has a border with Gaza. And Egypt has also tried to prevent Hamas terrorists from entering Egypt. That does not equal occupation, despite what people say. And if it's a genocide in Gaza, it's actually a very inefficient genocide, because since Israel left, the population of Gaza has multiplied many, many times. So a genocide, is almost the opposite of that.
I'm just remembering something I read from Michael Oren. I want to read it to you and just see what you think, okay? He wrote this piece basically about Israel often having to choose between its soul or its body. That was his idea. So in this case, it can either try to destroy Hamas and then lose those remaining hostages, or save the hostages and risk another situation like October 7th and so forth. Do you think these are mutually exclusive things? Do you think there's another possibility?
I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, but and the reason that Hamas agreed to release the hostages they've released, as I said before, about 100 of them, is because of the military pressure Israel is putting on Hamas. So effectively, those hostages were released by military force. Israel has a choice now, I think, or had a choice, perhaps that choice is gone, but had a choice between saying, well, getting those hostages back is our overwhelming priority. We will not resume hostilities. We will leave Hamas intact and do everything we can to try and get them back through negotiation. And I think that would have been a catastrophic decision. Of course, it's really important to get the hostages back. But what is perhaps even more important than that is to protect Israel's population from future attacks like the 7th of October. More slaughter, more rape, more burning alive, more torture, and more taking of hostages. I don't believe without continued military pressure that Hamas is ever likely to release those hostages. So there isn't really a great choice there, to be honest.
Hamas's strategy is a huge component is propaganda, as you explained earlier. Saying basically, to demonize Israel as much as possible through the killing of civilians. The people would say, well, Israel actually, how can you trust all those things you said about the IDF? I mean, you've talked before about the IDF being a kind of a uniquely disciplined military, doing these kind of unprecedented things like telling the people exactly where they're going to attack and so forth. There's also a kind of narrative out there that just says this is all propaganda. How can you be sure, Richard, that this is all true? And
I've watched the IDF up close. I've spoken to IDF commanders from the top to the bottom. And I know what their policies are. All their soldiers are trained in the laws of war and observing the laws of war. And it isn't just me. I know that after the last ground incursion into Gaza, which was 2014, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a delegation of military officers to Israel to learn from Israel how the IDF managed to fight so effectively while minimizing the loss of civilian life, so the US Army could learn from that. I came on a delegation myself with a group of retired generals, all of whom said that the bar that Israel was setting for fighting effectively with minimal civilian casualties was so high, their own armies would not be able to achieve it. And I'm talking about French, German, British, American, Australian, Indian, numerous armies from around the world saying this. And if you look at the statistics, the United Nations says that in wars since the Second World War, the ratio of civilian to military deaths in combat has been about 9-1, 9 civilians for every combatant killed. Sounds shocking, but that's the UN figure. If you look at US statistics, the US statistics in Afghanistan, it was about 3 civilians for every combatant killed. If you look at Iraq, it was between 3 and 5 civilians for every combatant killed. Israel's record is significantly better. And in the last major rounds of fighting against Hamas in Gaza, they were killing around 1 or 2 civilians for each combatant killed. So significantly better. Bad, always very bad when civilians die. But when your enemy uses human shields, unless you want to just let the enemy survive and continue to attack you, unfortunately, you end up having to inadvertently kill innocent civilians as well.
Well, in this sort of guerrilla war, right, which it is certainly on the side of Hamas, I mean, what is the combatants basically, assume the position of being non-combatants or pretend to be, or how does that work?
Yeah, of course. And it's the same with Afghanistan and Iraq. The 1 minute a terrorist will be hoeing the field as an innocent farmer or ploughing the field or whatever, and the next minute he will have taken up his weapon and start shooting at you, or he'll initiate a concealed bomb against you. And so that's very difficult. Unless a terrorist is actually shooting at you or is holding a rifle, it's very hard to distinguish between a terrorist and an innocent civilian. And it's one of the toughest parts of this kind of fighting, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, wherever. And that's their great strength. I think the IDF has a significant edge over most militaries when they're fighting in Gaza. Gaza is a very small area. The IDF have unrivaled intelligence on what's going on in Gaza. And they will use various human intelligence sources, as well as signals intercept, phone, radio intercept, internet intercept, etc., to be able to identify the locations of certain terrorists. And that's another means of distinguishing them, but it is a very, very hard thing to do.
So there's been a bunch of messaging out there, notably in social media, about the hostages being treated, quote, humanely, smiling faces, even letters that were written. And how do you understand that?
Yeah, well, it's part of Hamas's strategy, of course, to add pressure to Israel to gain sympathy for themselves. Of course, they have many, many supporters around the world, and there were people around the world, including in this region, who saw the footage of some of the horrors of 7th of October and thought it was a good thing. It's incredible to any decent thinking person's mind. And of course, Hamas want sympathy. They want people to think that they are freedom fighters, not terrorists. They're fighting for the survival of their people, which simply is not true. It's the opposite of the truth. And therefore, they will have coerced those hostages as they were released. Basically, you wave, you smile, you even put your arm around us, because if you don't, you're going to die. Or in some cases, we're still holding your husband or your wife, and they're going to die. So that's what's behind it. But the stories that are beginning to emerge now from released hostages are quite the opposite of that. They show that children were tortured, abused, mistreated. Just as one example, I think there were 2 boys who had their legs burnt, deliberately burnt, after being taken captive, so that if they escaped, they could be identified from the burn marks, just things like that. And there are many, many more, even more horrific stories coming out of it. So I think it should be seen as everything that Hamas does as being an attempt to glean support for themselves among people who perhaps don't support them and don't want them, and get them to get people to apply pressure against Israel.